Popular.com.
I killed Mrs. Mary J. Short. I killed her because I wanted her money. I expected that everything she had, which amounted to considerable, would come to me at her death. This was the substance of a confession made by Fred Fanning yesterday afternoon in the presence of County Attorney John J. Schenck and a number of other law enforcement officials. The confession was wrung from Fanning after he had been sweated for several hours by the local authorities and after sufficient proof had been obtained of the murder, almost to ensure conviction, even though the man continued to protest his innocence, as he did when first questioned. Mrs. Mary J. Short, wife of Sandy Short, who was killed in a pistol duel with police officer Doc Ward nearly 20 years ago, has been an object of charity in Topeka for many years, going about the streets with a heavy black veil over her face to hide a terrible cancer that had almost eaten one side of her face away. She was a familiar figure on the streets. On the morning of October 25th, she was taken sick very suddenly and died in a few minutes. Dr. E. M. Brockett was called to attend her, but the woman was dying when the doctor arrived, and he made a cursory examination and departed, reporting that she had died of heart failure. The body was embalmed and held by the undertaker until the arrival of Mrs. Fannie M. Mather, sister of Mrs. Short, from Seattle, Washington. Mrs. Mather reached here October 30th, a week ago last Saturday, and on the following day, Mrs. Short was buried. The story of events from then on for the week just ended was one of almost interminable little things that seemed to point to one man and made the suspicion entertained from the first that there was something wrong and more certain. This culminated yesterday morning in the arrest of Fred Fanning, who has been living with Mrs. Short for some time upon a charge of murder, and his making a confession of the entire crime late yesterday afternoon. Fanning declared, quote, "I wanted money to go into the restaurant business. Mrs. Fannie English, 210 East 5th Avenue, and I expected to start a restaurant here. Mrs. Short told me if I would take care of her until she died, I would get all the property she had, which amounted to quite a sum of money, and I was tired of waiting for her to die. I gave her Rough on Rats, and she lived only 30 minutes after I put it in her coffee." Unquote. The man told of several conversations with Mrs. English in which he said they had planned using Mrs. Short's money to start in business. But through all the grilling he was subjected to, he denied that Mrs. English had anything to do with the murder or even suspected that murder had been committed. He denied that he had told Mrs. English that he killed Mrs. Short since the commission of the crime, and by his story exonerated Mrs. English from any complicity. Fanning said he believed he was a nephew of Sandy Short, and that he told Mrs. Short he was related to her husband when he first came here about 2 years ago. Before he had been here long, he had made arrangements to live with the woman and take care of her until her death, with the understanding that her property was to go to him when she died. Contrary to the general idea regarding Mrs. Short, the woman had at different times quite considerable sums of money. According to Dr. H. Keith, she left $1,000 with him one night to be locked in his safe. She told Fanning, so the man said, only a short time before her death, that she had $450 in the Prudential Bank. And Fanning believed it was true. In addition, she is said to own a lot here in the city somewhere which has not been located yet, worth from $150 to $200. All this, Fanning said, he expected would come to him. The administration of Mrs. Short's estate is now in the hands of Reverend Charles A. Finch, named by the probate court to be administrator, and it was partly through Mr. Finch that it first became evident that something was wrong. Mrs. Mather, the dead woman's sister, also claimed to have much to do with the arrest yesterday and the subsequent confession wrung from unwilling lips. True Crime Historian presents yesterday's news. Tales of classic scandals, scoundrels, and scourges told from historic newspapers in the golden age of yellow journalism. Episode 137 is the quirky story of the death of a beloved widow in Topeka, Kansas. No one suspected any foul play until her caretaker, allegedly her late husband's nephew, suddenly confessed to murder, but then the autopsy told another story. Was Fred Fanning covering for someone? Or did someone have undue influence over his mind, if he had one? I'm true crime historian Richard O. Jones, and I give you Fred Fanning's false confession. Who killed the widow Short? Topeka, Kansas, November 7th, 1909. What has become of the money formerly owned by Mrs. Short is not known, and while Fanning denies that he had anything to do with it, the officers believe he may have helped squander it, although it is not believed that he has anything now. Fanning was arrested by Deputy Sheriff Judkins early yesterday morning and was taken through a thorough sweating at the county jail. There he waxed belligerent and declared he would have every man who had anything to do with the arrest locked up for false arrest. Later, however, upon being pressed by the deputy sheriff, he told the officers to come along and he would locate a pocketbook that belonged to Mrs. Short containing $45, which he had taken from her. Deputy Judkins at once accompanied the man, and together they went to the home of Mrs. English, where Fanning asked for a pocketbook he had left with the woman. She quickly returned with the pocketbook, containing two $20 gold certificates and a $5 greenback, the identical money that it was known had been taken from Mrs. Short either just before or just after her death. With so much known, it was a comparatively easy matter to wring the final confession from the guilty man. According to Mrs. Mather, Mrs. Short had been receiving money regularly from Mrs. Mather and also from a sister of Sandy Short, a Miss Molly Short, who lives in Los Angeles, California. In addition, she has been aided by many Topeka people, those kindly disposed having favored the unfortunate woman in every way possible, giving her money and otherwise siding her to make a living for herself. It is thought that much of this money was kept by Mrs. Short and that subsequently has fallen into the hands of the self-confessed murderer of the woman, who has squandered it in one way or another. Mrs. Short also had a brother, Frank Cox, who lives in Kansas City and who is blind. The brother, however, according to Mrs. Mather, has not been able to help Mrs. Short any since the death of Sandy 20 years ago. Fred Fanning is about 50 years old and is a rather nice-looking man. He has dark curly hair and a black mustache and is rather below the medium in height. He told the officers he was born in Michigan, but has lived the greater portion of his life in different parts of Illinois. He said he has no education and declared he can neither read nor write. Are you related to Sandy Short? Answer: that woman says I am not, pointing to Mrs. Mather. Question: but are you related to Short? Answer: I think I am his nephew, but I am not sure. Since living in Topeka, where he has been for the last 2 years, Fanning says he has been employed by paving and ditching contractors in ditch and sewer work. He says he has worked pretty steadily most of the time. He told the officers he has Indian blood in him, just how much or from what tribe he does not know. His high cheekbones and his dark hair, with the exception of his curls, bespeak the Indian blood. Fanning said, quote, "The Indian comes from my father. There is only a little of it," unquote. Fanning said he understood what the penalty of his crime will be and that he will serve the rest of his life in the penitentiary. He said, quote, "I didn't intend to give her so much poison." Question: "You intended to kill her, didn't you?" Answer: "Yes, I intended to kill her." Question: "Then it would not make very much difference whether you gave her a grain or a dram as long as the effect was the same, wouldn't it?" Among the many little things that have a part in tracing the crime to Fanning was the overhauling by the man of a trunk belonging to the dead woman shortly after her death. Also, when Mrs. Mather arrived here, Fanning was wearing mourning for Mrs. Short. This he discarded the day after the funeral. Mrs. Mather told the Reverend Mr. Finch several days ago she believed Fanning was guilty of murdering the woman, but Mr. Finch was a little slow to believe it. Taking it up with the county authorities, she made her case strong enough to interest the officers, and Deputy Sheriff Judkins, working with the aid of County Attorney Schenck, traced the crime home to Fanning. It is one of the pieces of criminal work the county attorney is feeling pretty good over, and he is willing to concede most of the laurels to Deputy Sheriff Judkins. Mrs. Mather believes that the $45 which Fanning has turned over to the officers, admitting he took from Mrs. Short, is a small thing compared to the amounts she believes he has squandered. Mrs. Mather declared, quote, "I don't believe there is any doubt but that the man has taken hundreds of dollars of my sister's money. Unless he tells us himself, I doubt very much if we will ever know the facts. But from what I know of the case, and the money I know has been sent to her besides what she has received from people here, there must have been a considerable sum missing." In order to prove the statements made by Fanning yesterday, Dr. H. Keith, county coroner, will order the body of Mrs. Short exhumed and will hold a post-mortem examination. With the confession before them, the officers will analyze the contents of the stomach in particular and determine the presence of poison there. Such will be necessary, it is said, to convict the prisoner as his own statement, in case he should change his mind and refuse to plead guilty in the district court, in order to convict him. While it is considered possible that the man may have told a falsehood in regard to the poison, it is considered unlikely, and the coroner quite confidently expects to find distinct traces of poison in the stomach of the dead woman, amply sufficient to justify a verdict of murder. After Fanning had been led back to a cell in the county jail, the county attorney said, quote, "The murder, the way it looks now, is one of the most cold-blooded ever committed in Shawnee County. Quite evidently, it has been planned in cold blood, and the plans had been carried out to a nicety. If it had not been for the man's cupidity, among other things, he might never have been apprehended. He was too anxious to get his fingers on the property of the woman he had murdered. Thus it is with many a criminal. Through some idiosyncrasy, perhaps, or a foible, or in an oversight of some particular feature that appeals to the officers at once, or as was the case in this instance, a man's impatience and anxiety to be possessed of the results of his crime, he is caught and finds himself in the toils of the law. It is hard, even for the most brainy men, to commit crime of a serious nature and make good in it. And for an illiterate man like Fanning, it would be next to impossible, in spite of the fact that he came very near making good in this case. Dr. Keith said, quote, "I have no doubt but that traces, perhaps quite a quantity of arsenic, will be found in the stomach. I am satisfied Fanning told the truth, and if so, as Mrs. Short died within 30 minutes after the poison was administered, there should be quite a bit of it left in the stomach. It would have been impossible for much of it to have been absorbed by the system. November 8th, 1909. On the testimony of Fred Fanning, the man who was Saturday morning arrested for the murder of Mrs. Mary Short on October 25th, that Mrs. Minnie McCauley, alias Mrs. Minnie English, the woman whom he intended to marry, influenced him to murder Mrs. Short, and that he gave into her possession $1,461.60 of Mrs. Short's money. The McCauley woman was arrested yesterday morning. A perfunctory examination brought out no confession from her. She denied that she had received more than $45 from Fanning, and this amount she turned over to Deputy Sheriff Ben Judkins. She denies she had anything to do with the murder of Mrs. Short. Fanning yesterday told Mrs. Fanny Mather, sister of Mrs. Short, who is here from Seattle, that Mrs. English, or McCauley, whatever her name is, had caused the murder of Mrs. Short. Fanning claims that the McCauley woman found out that Mrs. Short had money and influenced him to get it for the purpose of going into the bakery or restaurant business in Iola. Mrs. McCauley also proposed marriage to him, he said. While she at first beguiled him to get the money, he claims, she later persuaded him to continue the practice by threatening his life. Fanning, in turn, extorted the money from Mrs. Short by threatening her life. Quote, Mrs. McCauley was the cause of the whole affair. She forced me to do it. She said she would fix me if I didn't get the money. She told me what to use and how much to use. I didn't mean to kill Mrs. Short. I only wanted to make her sick, as I did once before, to get her money. She was given too much a second time, and she died. I didn't want to do it, and she, Mrs. McCauley, is at the bottom of it all. Unquote. This is the substance of the later confession Manning made in the sweat box at the county jail yesterday afternoon. Fanning made the same statements to Mrs. Mather during the morning. Fanning was inclined to deny some of the charges against the McCauley woman yesterday afternoon, but Mrs. Mather prompted him on different points, and he acknowledged their truth. According to Fanning's statement, he met the McCauley woman last spring in the city park when he and Mrs. Short were there attending a band concert. Mrs. Short invited Mrs. McCauley to their home, and a friendship grew up between them. Mrs. McCauley early learned of the money Mrs. Short possessed and contrived to get hold of it. Fanning says that the woman influenced him to get the $1,000 which Mrs. Short deposited in Dr. Keith's safe, and when he gave it to her, she told him she would take care of it. She went to Salina immediately afterward for 5 weeks. Fanning asked her about the money when she returned, and she told him it was none of his business. Fanning says he later secured money in sums of $5, $10, $20, and $50 from Mrs. Short. These amounts he turned over to the McCauley woman. When he had given her about $400, Fanning says the woman again went away, to Silver Lake this time, for a short stay. He claims he never again saw that money. In all, he claims to have given the woman $1,461.60. A purse was found in the possession of Mrs. McCauley containing $45, which she claims is the total amount which she gave her. Fanning took his meals with the McCauley woman at her home. He worked in the city park at night, and it was there that the woman came when the transfers of money were made. Support your favorite podcaster at www.patreon.com/truecrimehistorian. Just $1 a month reserves your bunk at the safe house and gives you access to exclusive content and whatever personal services you require. November 9th, 1909. Another statement in which he exonerated Mrs. Minnie Macaulay, alias Minnie English, and took all the blame upon himself in regard to the murder of Mrs. Mary J. Short 2 weeks ago, was made by Fred Fanning to representatives of the county attorneys and sheriff's offices yesterday afternoon. As an excuse for his statement of Sunday that Mrs. Macaulay had urged him to commit the crime and had been responsible for planning it, Fanning said, quote, "Mrs. Mather told me that if I would throw the blame on Mrs. Macaulay, she would get me out of this trouble and pay my way to Illinois," unquote. Mrs. Fanny Mather, sister of Mrs. Short, was not present at the interview yesterday, and as the officers failed to break the man down in other portions of the story, it is generally accepted that he is telling the truth in at least two important particulars. First, it is believed beyond question that Fanning murdered Mrs. Short, and then it is believed he robbed her, of how much is still a question. The man reiterated over and over again during the talk with the officers, quote, "Yes, I killed Mrs. Short. I put poison in her coffee. I wanted her money," unquote. So many times has he made this assertion, and so closely has he stuck to his original story in that particular regard, that any doubt that might have existed as to the truth of his story of the murder has been banished from the officers' minds. However, the report of the test of the stomach that will be made in a few days will be closely watched and will be interesting to those who have been following the case in the extreme. Upon the report will be based the first certain corroboration of Fanning's story in case traces of arsenic are found. In his statement yesterday, Fanning told the officers he'd taken a total of $1,461.60 from Mrs. Short. He declared that he took the $1,000 that was deposited overnight with Dr. Keith last August and hid it under a step at the back of the house where he and Mrs. Short were living. He said he has used it, or portions of it, at various times to pay grocery bills, to buy a few things for himself, and to buy some smaller articles of jewelry which he has given to Mrs. English, and which have been recovered by the officers. Ending, he declared that part of the money, as much as $700, ought to be under the step still. A search of the place, however, proved that there is no money there, and if Fanning is telling the truth, somebody else has taken the money from its hiding place and confiscated it. Fanning said, quote, "I took $400 at another time. Then the last time I took $61.60, all the money I could find, and it was part of that money that was found at the house of Mrs. Macaulay. I used the other $16 to pay a grocery bill," unquote. As $45 was in the pocketbook recovered from Mrs. Macaulay, and a receipt for $16 was discovered from a groceryman that was made recently, this portion of his story appeals to the officers as the truth. Quote, "Mrs. Short accused me of taking her money when she first missed the $1,000. I told her to keep her mouth shut or I would kill her. She said something about it several times after that, but I always stopped her by threatening to kill her. I took part of the money by giving her some rough on rats once before and making her sick," unquote. Regarding the purpose for which he wanted the money and his intention of going into the restaurant business with Mrs. Macaulay, Fanning has stuck to his original story through all the sweating that he has had at the hands of the officers. His story implicating Mrs. Macaulay that was made Sunday was not more than half believed at the time. And later, after the woman had been arrested and had shown how poor she was, the officers believed even less of it. While Fanning's excuse for telling the falsehood came as a sort of surprise, yet the exoneration of Mrs. Macaulay was expected if the truth were to be wrung from him. During the morning Sunday before the statement implicating Mrs. McCauley was made, Mrs. Mather was talking to Fanning and had been praying with him, declaring in the presence of the officers that she forgave him and asking the Lord to do the same. That she may have made promises to him, as Fanning declares she did, is believed to have been possible. Much of the man's story, however, is given scanty credence, and for that reason alone, if there were no other motives, the result of the chemical analysis of Mrs. Short's stomach will be waited for with interest. In being exonerated, as may be the case in light of the last statement by Fanning, from any complicity in the Short murder, Mrs. McCauley is by no means out of trouble. She, together with Edward English, who has been living with her since last spring as her husband, are being held charged with disorderly conduct, if nothing worse, and both have admitted the truth of such a charge. English said he did not believe it was necessary to be married to a woman to live with her, and Mrs. McCauley, who has been married 3 times before she met English, simply says she has been keeping house for the man since the 1st of April. The charge, however, does not entail anything worse than a few months in the county jail or a fine, and does not endanger the prisoners to a term in the penitentiary. Mrs. McCauley is a member of a religious organization that is called by its adherents the Pentecostals, and by the world at large the Holy Rollers. She has been a familiar figure at many of the street meetings of the sect, and has been loud in her prayers and entreaties of sinners to be saved, it is said. Now, in the hour of need, her brethren of the sect seem to have turned her down, as but one so far has come to see her, and that one offered to try to, quote, make the woman tell the truth, unquote, and ended by saying she, quote, always thought Mrs. English was a good Christian woman, unquote, was sorry to find out otherwise and like regrets. Lonnie McCauley, the 16-year-old son of Mrs. McCauley, is also being held at the county jail, not because he is believed to have been implicated in the Short murder or because the authorities have anything else against him, but because it is believed he may know something which will help the officers in the final solution of some of the mysteries surrounding the entire case. So far, it seems that Fanning's charge against Mrs. McCauley will accomplish the conviction of that woman and her quasi-husband. Mrs. McCauley has lived at 210 East 5th Street since coming here nearly a year ago, and it was from there she was taken to a jail Sunday morning to face a charge of complicity in the Short murder. However, she steadfastly denied any knowledge, either before or after, of the crime, and has acquitted herself from a long course of sweating in a way that almost convinced the officers of her innocence. The statement yesterday of Fanning about finishes any case against her and makes it as though it had not been. Salina, Kansas, November 10th, 1909. In an attempt to implicate Mrs. Minnie McCauley in the murder of Mary J. Short with Fred Fanning, the woman's confessed murderer, Mrs. Fanny M. Mather, sister of Mrs. Short, spent yesterday in Salina to determine what Mrs. McCauley did there last summer when she said she went to nurse Edward English, her paramour. Mrs. Fanny M. Mather, sister of the murdered woman, arrived in town Tuesday afternoon for the purpose of locating the $1,000 which she claims Fred Fanning, the murderer, secured from Mrs. Short a little while before he gave her the fatal dose of Rough on Rats. Mrs. Mather says that this $1,000 was sent to Mrs. Elizabeth English, alias Mrs. Minnie McCauley, who was living in Salina at the time at the home of Mrs. Elizabeth Renard of North 10th Street. It is Mrs. Mather's idea that the $1,000 is still in Salina, either in some bank or in a safety deposit box. The case is one of extraordinary sensations. Mrs. Mather of Seattle says that Fanning, who did the murder, was under the thumb of Mrs. English. She says that Fanning had taken advantage of Mrs. English's 13-year-old daughter and that Mrs. English was threatening to send him to the penitentiary unless he would give her $1,000. Fanning, to save himself from the pen, Mrs. Mather claims, forced Mrs. Short to give him the money under the penalty of death. Mrs. Mather said to a Salina Journal reporter today, quote, "I don't care for the money. I have plenty of money. I will give $100 to anyone who will locate the $1,000 just because I want to connect this Englishwoman and her husband with the murder and send them to the penitentiary. I don't care about the money, but the locating of it will be very important. I'm going to stay with this case until I get those people into Lansing," unquote. Mrs. McCauley went by the name of English in Salina. With her in Salina was her husband, Ed English, and a little daughter aged 13 years. Mrs. Mather claims that the woman and English were never married, but simply lived together. While English was here, he worked about the street making photographs with a flashlight machine. Mrs. Mather said, quote, "That money is in Salina, and I'm going to get it. It was stolen from my murdered sister and was given to that Englishwoman who I know is at the bottom of the whole thing. I will have her in jail in Topeka, and I will never let up until she lands behind the prison walls at Lansing. My sister was murdered in cold blood on October 25th. I was called to Topeka from Seattle, Washington. I got to Topeka just in time to attend the funeral of my sister, and just after the funeral was over, I began to work on the suspicions which I had from the time I received word of my sister's death. I first had Fanning arrested because I thought he knew all about it. It was I that made him confess to the murder. He told me all about the money that he had taken from my sister to give to Mrs. English. He told me that in last June he went with my sister to Dr. Keith and got $1,000, which my sister had in Dr. Keith's safe. My sister gave the $1,000 to Fanning because he told her that Mrs. English would murder him if he did not get her the money. Fanning told me that he was intimate with the 13-year-old English girl, for which Mrs. English, who found it out, told him she would have him sent to the penitentiary if he did not get her $1,000. That is why he got that $1,000 from my sister. Mrs. English came direct to Salina after Fanning gave her that money. She came here on the pretense that her husband was sick near here and sent for her, but that was all bosh. He was not sick at all. He is accessory to the crime. I have found out where they stayed here in Salina, and I am now going to find out where that money is. As I have to go back to Topeka this morning, I am offering $100 reward to the person who will locate the money for me. I have the Englishwoman in jail at Topeka. It was just after we locked her up that the little 13-year-old girl told me about Salina. She told me that her mother was arrested here once. I think that must have been another time, as Mrs. English lived in Salina at one time for about 2 years. I do not know just when it was. Fanning and Mrs. English robbed my sister of everything she had. I found my sister's diamond rings on Mrs. English. Fanning had her watch. It was 5 days from the time my sister was murdered until I got to Topeka, and during this time Fanning had charge of her house. He carried the keys, and he and Mrs. English robbed the house almost bare. Now, what I think they did with a lot of my sister's goods was to ship it out to some other town. We are also looking this up," unquote. Mrs. Mather is working hard on her case. When she began on it, no one had been arrested, and there was hardly any suspicion that anything was wrong in connection with her sister's death. She has ferreted it out until she has 5 different persons in jail at Topeka. They are Fred Fanning, who has confessed to giving Mrs. Short rough-on-rats to kill her, Mrs. English, who Fanning implicates in the murder, Ed English, husband of Mrs. English, and the 2 English children. Mrs. Mather says that there will be some more arrests before she is through with the case. Quote, "Fanning is kind of a religious fanatic, and I made him confess by talking religion to him. I could have made Mrs. English confess the same way if the officers had just let me alone. Some of those Topeka police officers are mighty slow. I have really worked up all the evidence that has been worked up so far, and I have done it at my own expense," unquote. When Mrs. Mather was at the Union Pacific Depot this afternoon before her train arrived, she was again interviewed, and this time she said that Mrs. English brought $1,000 to Selena about the 1st of August instead of June. Last night and early this morning, Mrs. Mather said it had happened in June. Mrs. Mather went back to Topeka this morning, and she left the Selena officers a lot of scattered information which puzzles them somewhat. They do not know just exactly when Mrs. English brought the money to Selena, or whether she brought it here at all or not. Up until 2 o'clock this afternoon, Sheriff Heck had not made any discoveries regarding the whereabouts of the $1,000. As far as it is known now, the English family did not commit any crime while they were in Selena, except that it is claimed that Mrs. English was not married to the man whom she passed off as her husband. The English family stopped at 2 different places in Selena. When they first came here, they stopped at the Drake Building on South Santa Fe, just opposite the convention hall. The police say that they know when they were living in this building. The English family moved from the Drake Building to the home of Mrs. Elizabeth Renard on North 10th Street, where they rented 2 rooms. Mrs. Renard says, quote, "I'm quite sure that Mrs. English rented the 2 rooms about the last week of July. She, with her husband and little girl, were here until about the 20th of August when they left. Mrs. English told me that they had come from Topeka. She said that her husband had been working in the harvest fields around here and had taken sick. She said she came up to look after him. She said she stayed somewhere on Santa Fe 4 days before coming here. Mrs. English was always very hard up for money while she was here. Once a week she would go out to do washing for a Mrs. Myers. She never said very much about her past life. I never once thought of her having money with her. I do not know anything against the woman, although I suspicioned several times that something was wrong. I never did say anything because I did not know. Mrs. English and the man whom she called her husband took a walk every night. Sometimes the little girl went with them, and sometimes she stayed at home alone. The little girl never went out after night without her mother." Unquote. Before leaving this morning, Mrs. Mather stated it was possible that the money was buried, but she is strong in her belief that the money is hidden in Salina. When she was shown the article in the Topeka Capital this morning telling about another confession which Fanning had made in which he completely exonerated Mrs. English, Mrs. Mather said, quote, "That is simply a trick of Fanning's. He has had a talk with Mrs. English, and it is a trick to get the woman out of it. If she is out of jail by the time I get back to Topeka, I will have her arrested again. I did tell Fanning that I would try to get the sheriff to send him to Illinois if he would tell me all about Mrs. English. You see, I wanted him to tell me, so that is the reason I talked to him like I did." Unquote. Topeka, Kansas, November 11th, 1909. It was discovered yesterday that a package which Mrs. Fanny M. Mather found in the Short house and which was supposed to contain rough on rats was only a rat paste. Deputy Sheriff Bennett Judkins visited the house yesterday morning and after hunting around found the package, a portion of which it is believed Fanning gave Mrs. Short in her coffee to kill her. The officers believe that Fanning, who has told a half-dozen conflicting stories regarding the money he took from Mrs. Short, and for the securing of which he says he committed murder, is almost an imbecile, and that he belongs to about the lowest type of humanity. He is hopelessly ignorant and does not seem to realize in the least the enormity of the crime with which he is charged. Mrs. Mather, who spent the last 2 days in Salina, returned yesterday afternoon without locating the $1,000 she believed Fanning took from Mrs. Short and gave to Mrs. Minnie McCauley. Mrs. Mather felt sure the money had been hidden in Salina and hoped to get a trace of it, but she failed, although she still protests that she believes it is deposited in a bank there. The officers, however, do not believe now that Mrs. Short ever had any such amount of money, and that all that Fanning got probably did not amount to more than $100 or $200. And all that Fanning got probably did not amount to more than $100 or $200. November 13th, 1909. It was disclosed yesterday that a wife, baby, and brother-in-law of Fred Fanning died within a short time of one another at the place Fanning was then living, Pekin, Illinois. Fanning said they died and showed a marriage certificate to prove that he had been married. The officers wonder if there was not something suspicious in the deaths, occurring quite close together, and have communicated with the Pekin authorities to learn more of the man's conduct while there. Fanning was married by the probate judge at Pekin, Illinois, according to the certificate he has, on May 5, 1903, to Sarah Markwick. According to the man's statement, his wife died about a year after they were married. Shortly afterward, their little baby died, and within a year, a 14-year-old brother of Mrs. Fanning, whom she had asked her husband to care for, also died. The boy, Fanning said, lived with his wife and himself after their married life, and with him after his wife and baby died. November 16th, 1909. In spite of numerous supposed confessions of Fred Fanning, to the effect that he killed the unfortunate Mrs. Mary Short for her money by giving her rough-on rats in her coffee, the following verdict was rendered by a coroner's jury yesterday afternoon about 5 o'clock, after the entire day had been spent hearing evidence. Quote, "The said jurors on their oaths do say that the said Mary J. Short came to her death by natural causes." Unquote. The forenoon was taken up for the most part by the reading by Mrs. W. E. Atchison of stenographic notes taken from confessions by Fanning, as have been reported. Deputy Sheriff Bennett Judkins was called to the stand to prove the arrest of Fanning, and also a statement by Fanning that he had lied when he implicated Mrs. McCauley, the witness testifying that Fanning said he had done so upon a promise by Mrs. Mather to forgive him, to see him out of his trouble, and pay his way to Pekin, Illinois. The sensation of the hearing was reached when Professor F.B. Daines of Washburn College was called to the stand shortly after 4 o'clock to tell of his examination of the stomach of Mrs. Short. The professor declared he had been unable to find even so much as a trace of arsenic, and this culminating bit of evidence, in addition to much more that failed to show utterly that Fanning had killed the woman he said he had killed, decided the matter without doubt. The professor described in detail many of the operations incident to the analysis. He said one operation was so minute that it would show traces of arsenic in potatoes when Paris green had been used on growing plants to kill insects. Going further, he declared that not a trace of arsenic could be found either in the stomach, the contents of the stomach, or the liver, he having made examinations of all three separately. Dr. J. M. Amos and Dr. R. S. McGee testified they assisted at an autopsy held a week ago last Sunday when the body of Mrs. Short was exhumed, and that an examination was made of the heart. Both testified that the heart was in bad condition, so that it may have easily been the cause of Mrs. Short's death. Mrs. Anna Dubick and Mrs. Fanny Holcomb, both near neighbors of Mrs. Short and who were called in when Mrs. Short lay dying, testified there were no symptoms to indicate arsenic poisoning. It was testified by physicians that death from arsenic poisoning was accompanied by violent pains in the stomach, and that it was next to impossible for death to occur within a half an hour, as Fanning has said Mrs. Short died about that length of time after he had administered the poison. Both neighbors denied that Mrs. Short complained of her stomach and declared she was short of breath and complained of her head. Mrs. Hattie T. Carson testified that Fanning followed her around and bothered her. She said he used to call her his little Dago, but she knew nothing except that she had cared for Mrs. Short about 8 years ago when the woman had just come from the poor farm. She said at one time Mrs. Short took a roll of bills from her stockings and showed her, containing a large number of $10 and $5 notes. Mrs. Sarah M. Howard, the owner of the house where Mrs. McCauley lives, denied several intimations of Mrs. Mather that a trunk had been taken to her house by Fanning and Mrs. McCauley in the dead of the night. Fanning himself was placed upon the stand, but only said, "I have nothing to say," repeating the phrase over and over. After the report of Dr. Danes had been made, he was asked why he made the confession, and he only mumbled again the same phrase, "I have nothing to say." It is believed the man is very nearly crazy, and that a commission in lunacy may be more what he deserves than a trial in district court. The jury was out scarcely 15 minutes. Following closely on the verdict of the coroner's jury and the dismissal of the case, as far as any attempt to prove murder is concerned, Mrs. Fanny M. Mather caused the sensation of the day by standing in the upper corridor of the courthouse and in a voice that could be heard all over the building denounced the city, the county, all the officials who have had anything to do with the famous case. "Do you believe that Fred Fanning murdered your sister?" Mrs. Mather was asked. She replied, quote, "I certainly do. I believe this whole case has been a concocted scheme from start to finish, and that there was never any attempt on the part of anybody to prove the guilt of that murderer. And during my stay here I have been insulted and abused as never I was in the history of my life." Unquote. Fanning, who during the entire day sat in the courtroom, trembling and exceedingly nervous during the morning, and during the afternoon comparatively calm but motionless, is now held with grand larceny, the county attorney feeling he can no longer hold the man for murder. Mrs. Minnie McCauley, her 16-year-old son Lonnie McCauley, and her quasi-husband Edward English were released at the close of the hearing and went away from the courthouse rejoicing. Fanning is charged with the theft of $45 from Mrs. Short's apartments shortly after the death, which money the testimony showed he asked Mrs. McCauley to keep for him the Thursday after Mrs. Short died. The case as it is now looks as though it would end, is unparalleled in the criminal annals of Shawnee County. Every bit of evidence, except the confessions Fanning himself made over and over again, proved that murder had not been committed, but that, as was the first statement of Dr. E. M. Brockett, who was called as Mrs. Shorts was dying, the woman died of heart disease. Mrs. Mather herself was the feature of yesterday's hearing, admitting that she had no reason, at least no legitimate reason, for believing that Fred Fanning committed the crime with which he was charged. She insisted that nothing could shake her belief that he is guilty. County Attorney Schenck asked, quote, "In case that it is found that no trace of poison is found in the stomach, would you still believe Mrs. Short was murdered?" Unquote. She replied, "I certainly would." Question, "And that Fred Fanning murdered her?" Answer, "Yes." Mrs. Mather testified that her sister was 54 years old, that she had not seen her for 20 years. She declared Mrs. Short was married to Sandy Short about 24 years ago at Kansas City, Missouri, and that she has lived the most of the time since in Topeka. Mrs. Mather told of how she had received cheerful letters from her sister, how she believed Mrs. Short was being provided for, how she, the witness, had been sending a total of approximately $5 a month to Mrs. Short, with which she might pay such bills as were necessary to be paid. She told in detail how she had made a loan the day before she left Seattle, and how she borrowed $200 with which to come to Topeka. She described her meeting with Fred Fanning, and declared she at once said that Sandy Short never had a nephew. Fanning said that he was a nephew of the man. Mrs. Mather told of numerous dreams, both of herself and others, and declared she believed before she left home, and believed after reaching here, always has believed and always will, that her sister was murdered and robbed. concluding she denied singularly and in the aggregate any knowledge of Mrs. Short's methods of life or of obtaining money, any promises to Fanning, any knowledge of a host of circumstances surrounding the life of her sister here during the 20 years since she has seen her, and any undue influence over Fanning in an effort to force a confession from him. Mrs. Minnie Macaulay quickly, vehemently, and part of the time almost passionately denied any knowledge of the murder or any part in it. She declared she had never seen more than $55 at once in her life, and declared that was when she was a girl 9 years old. She admitted that Fanning took her to the moving picture shows twice, scouting the story Fanning told to the effect that he had taken enough to spend about $300 in such amusements. She told of her trip to Salina and declared she borrowed $2.40, the necessary fare, from Will Wagner, giving him a mortgage on her household goods to secure the payment. As Fanning never told his story twice alike, and as he told several things that afterward he admitted were false, and also as he insisted that he murdered a woman whom it was proved had not been murdered, it is thought probable that he has something serious the matter with his mind, and that a trial for lunacy is much more proper than a trial in the district court. November 18th, 1909. A marriage license was issued yesterday afternoon to Edward English and Mrs. Minnie Macaulay, held here for a week in connection with the supposed murder of Mrs. Mary J. Short, and last night at 7 o'clock they were made husband and wife, Pastor L.B. Delk of the Mission of the Nazarene performing the ceremony. The marriage of the pair is the culmination of several months of life together, and also of unsuccessful efforts to find a place where they will be permitted to stay since their liberation from the county jail last Monday. Declared English yesterday, quote, "I believe in free love as much as I ever did, but we have decided we might as well conform to the customs of other people. We are to be married tonight, and then we hope our troubles will be at an end. We have had a time since our liberation from jail. We found a room after a great deal of trouble where we were told we could stay, and we had moved our things into it. Then, when we were ready to take possession, the people refused to let us in until we had been married. It made it hard on us, for I haven't any money, and Minnie hasn't either, but we found a friend who loaned us enough to get a license. Brother Delk has promised to perform the ceremony for nothing, so we will be all right tonight." Unquote. The marriage last night is one of the last phases of what has been believed to have been a sensational murder. But following the verdict of the coroner's jury last Monday to the effect that Mrs. Short had come to her death by natural causes, thus exonerating Fanning in spite of his confession, Mrs. Macaulay, her paramour, and son were released from jail. Then the trouble began. They were not allowed to return to the place where they had been staying. The story that they were not married spread far and wide, and even those who did not know the pair, upon learning their names, they were refused a place to stay. The inevitable result was the ceremony last night. November 19th, 1909. Mrs. Fanny M. Mather shook the dust of Kansas from her feet yesterday after spending 3 days telling the people around the city what a poor bunch of officials there are here. Mrs. Mather declared in bidding Sheriff Jonathan D. Norton goodbye, quote, "You are the only decent officer of the county I have met so far. The others, well, words do not express my contempt for them." Unquote. Mrs. Mather has been angry ever since a verdict of the coroner's jury, impaneled to hear the evidence regarding the death of Mrs. Short, found that the death had been due to natural causes, setting for nothing the confession of Fanning that the death had been the result of the administering of rough-on rats with criminal intent. She had made a sensation last Monday shortly after the verdict of the coroner's jury by standing in the upper corridor of the courthouse and in a voice that could be heard all over the building. She steadfastly refused to believe any evidence that seemed to show Fanning had not committed the crime with which he was charged, and declared until the last that her sister had been murdered in cold blood and robbed. Quote, "My sister's property has been divided among officers of this town, and I have abundant evidence to prove it. It is in the hands of high officials of the county, and they know I know they have it. I shall be back about January, and at that time I shall see that this matter is sifted to the bottom, and somebody will suffer. The voice of my sister's blood cries from the ground for vengeance upon these people, and it will come sooner or later." Unquote. December 3rd, 1909. Fred Fanning, confessed murderer of Mrs. Mary J. Short, is crazy. At least a commission in lunacy yesterday found him of unsound mind and advised his commitment in the state hospital for the insane after a hearing that lasted nearly all day. Fanning himself was the principal witness, and before the county attorney and the commission had finished asking him questions, he had reiterated every statement he had ever made before, had declared that he had murdered Mrs. Short, and that he had not murdered her, told the circumstances of the murder in the minutest detail, and then swore that he did not remember ever having confessed the crime, and that he had never seen Rough on Rats, which he said he had put in Mrs. Short's coffee, and that he did not know what it was like. His testimony in his own behalf was one of endless contradiction, showing at last, and which was testified to by other witnesses, that he had been dominated over by Mrs. Fanny M. Mather, sister of Mrs. Short, who came here from Seattle, Washington, to clear up the mystery, and also that he would answer any question in the affirmative if pressed to do so. Fanning began by denying that he had seen Assistant County Attorney William E. Atchison before, and denying ever having talked to County Attorney John J. Schenck about the supposed murder. "Why did you say you gave Mrs. Short Rough on Rats?" demanded the county attorney suddenly. Fanning hung his head and then said he did not remember saying it. "Didn't you tell me that?" persisted the attorney. "I don't remember," Fanning mumbled. "I didn't kill Mrs. Short," Fanning asserted a few seconds later. "I know I didn't kill her because the judge told me so at the time of the inquest." "Did you think you had killed her before that?" he was asked. "Yes, I did." Fanning talked intelligently enough when talking of his early life. Led on by Dr. Johnson, he told of his boyhood, that he had never been to school because he was compelled to work, of his relatives, of his first marriage and the subsequent death of his wife and baby within a few days of each other, betraying a little emotion when talking about them. He told a reasonably clear story of his meeting with Mrs. Short about a year ago, and how he had lived with her ever since, declaring he believed he was her nephew by marriage. He said he gave Mrs. Short all the money he made, and that she paid the bills with it, and saved the balance for him. When the subject of the supposed murder was broached again, he denied positively any knowledge of it, finally admitting that he remembered telling the officers that he had committed the crime and declaring he was sorry he had told them. Later, however, under the fire of examination by the county attorney, he confessed to the murder once more, telling substantially the same story that he told a month ago, and declared that he murdered the unfortunate woman for her money. In another dozen minutes after he had been given a breathing spell, when asked questions that suggested he did not kill the woman, he was denying the crime vehemently. Referring to Mrs. Mather, he declared the woman made him lay what blame he did on Mrs. Minnie McCauley, that she visited him in jail and sang to him, that she put her arms around his neck, and declared that she and all the world would forgive him if he confessed to the crime. "Mrs. Mather told me to lay it all on her," Fanning declared, speaking of Mrs. McCauley. "She told me if I would, she would give me the money to go home." That the man is possessed of a very low order of intelligence, the commission agreed. That he is a menace to the safety of society, the members of the commission also agreed. That he ought to be placed where he could not do anyone any harm was freely expressed. Declared Dr. Ryder, quote, "Such a man is a menace. He might be persuaded to commit murder, and if one talked to him in the right light, I believe he would attempt such a thing in a moment. He isn't safe, crazy or not crazy," unquote. The case has been one without parallel in the criminal annals of Shawnee County. Without needing any particular urging, a man confessed to having perpetrated one of the worst imaginable crimes. Later, he pleaded with tears in his eyes that the county attorney would permit him to go to the penitentiary and suffer the consequences of his crime. He begged to be allowed to take a life sentence at Lansing. Afterward, a coroner's jury exonerated him from the crime he had fastened upon himself, and every bit of evidence introduced in the case went to show that the commission of the crime was impossible to have occurred. Fanning, probably, will be ordered committed in the state hospital here within a few days. December 28th, 1909. The mental depravity, or better, the absence of any mentality in Fred Fanning, is now being put to a novel use. He is being used in the study of alienation by medical students of the Kansas Medical College as a subject with so little mind that it can be warped or twisted at the will of almost anyone. Fanning is proving a willing subject for various mental tests, and he responds by doing anything and everything that he is pressed to do. Questioned, he asserts the first thing that comes to his mind, presumably, and can be drawn to contradict himself in a moment after he has made a positive assertion. Since being taken to the asylum, he has told over and over again the story of Mrs. Short's death, now saying that he committed the crime without knowing why he did it, again admitting the crime and giving all the details of why it was done, saying that he wanted the woman's money, and telling ridiculous stories about her wealth, and still again vehemently denying the commission of the crime. Questioned along a certain line, medical students say, he can be led to make any sort of statement, to admit anything, or to fashion the most unbelievable story. The next moment, if questioned from a different angle, he will be denying his former assertions and will be telling another story, perhaps as unbelievable as the first, but in direct contradiction to what he has already said. Said one student, quote, "He comes nearer not having any mind than anyone I ever saw. As near as I can tell, his mind is so weak, or there is so little gray matter in his skull, that he will tell anything, admit anything, confess to anything. He is a wonder in his way, a sort of missing link between man and a monkey, only I am inclined to believe that in some ways he has less intelligence than the average monkey. The small amount of reasoning power he possesses, almost, is unbelievable," unquote. Thus the man is proving a valuable subject for study, and the medical students are availing themselves of live enlightenment regarding the absence of mental power in a human being. March 31st, 1910. Fred Fanning yesterday was paroled from the State Hospital for the Insane by Superintendent T.C. Biddle. Fanning created a sensation in Topeka when he was tried last December on his own confession of having poisoned Mrs. Mary J. Short. He confessed to having given her rough-on rats from which she died for the purpose of getting her money. The trial lasted several days and ended with Fanning being released by the jury, which refused to accept the man's confession on the grounds that the examination of the stomach showed no trace of poison of any kind. He was then sent to the state hospital, but still insisted that he had poisoned Mrs. Short. He was sent to his home in Illinois yesterday as Superintendent Biddle considered that he was more of an imbecile and a dullard than an insane person. Said Dr. Biddle, quote, "Fanning has worked ever since he has been at the hospital and seemed to be improved. I consider him more of an imbecile than an insane person and believe that he will be better off with his people than to be kept here, supported by the state." That was Fred Fanning's false confession. Who killed the widow Short? After being paroled from the state hospital for the criminally insane, Fred Fanning made his way back to Pekin, Illinois, where he got married again. He and his wife were arrested in 1914 for taking a quantity of large sugar, canned goods, and other provisions from a bakery. In 1918, Fred Fanning fell into ill health and died after a prolonged stay in the county hospital. Theme music by Dave Sams, media management by Sean R. Jones, production assistance by Emily Seimer-Braun, and I'm true crime historian Richard O. Jones, signing off for now.